As I stood there on the cobbled streets near Buckingham Palace, the anticipation in the air was almost tangible. The early morning sun was beginning to warm the stones, casting a soft golden hue across the landscape. Tourists from all over the world had gathered, their faces filled with excitement and curiosity. The moment had arrived, the changing of the guard ceremony, one of Britain's most beloved traditions, and a spectacle that had been held for centuries. It wasn't just a ceremony, it was a living piece of history, something that tied the present to the past in a way that was uniquely British. As a long-time resident of London, I had seen this many times, yet the excitement never quite wore off. For some, it was a once-in-a-lifetime event, a memory they would take home to wherever they had come from, whether from the distant lands of Asia, Europe, or North America. For me, it was something I had grown used to, yet always found myself drawn into its magnetic charm. The crowd was a mosaic of people from all walks of life, each person eager to witness the perfection and precision that was synonymous with the Royal Guard. Some stood silently, heads lifted, eyes fixed on the guards in their iconic red tunics and black bearskin caps, while others fumbled with their cameras, eager to capture a moment of this grand spectacle. Children perched on their parents' shoulders, the excitement of the ceremony reflected in their wide eyes. Their voices filled with wonder as they asked questions and pointed at the soldiers marching with military precision, but amidst the sea of faces, there was one that caught my attention. A small girl, no more than 7 or 8, stood rigidly, her hand firmly held by an adult man beside her. Her posture was unnaturally stiff, the kind of stillness you rarely see in children, especially in such an exciting and vibrant atmosphere. While the others around her bubbled with joy, pointing and laughing, she remained eerily quiet, her eyes darting nervously between the guards and the man beside her. There was something about her that didn't fit the usual picture of a child at such an event. Her stillness was unsettling, but more so, it seemed out of place in a sea of excitement. The man with her was tall and well-dressed, his demeanor exuding confidence, almost arrogance. His fingers tightened around her wrist, pulling her closer to his side as the guards began their march forward, their boots striking the cobblestones in perfect unison. A flicker of something, fear, perhaps, crossed the girl's face when her eyes met those of the soldier nearest to her. For a brief moment, she forgot her rigid posture, her gaze softening, her fascination with the guards momentarily taking over her. But the moment was fleeting. As soon as the man noticed her distraction, he shifted slightly, and his grip on her arm tightened, a warning in his movement. I couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the way the girl behaved and the others around her. There was a sharp, uncomfortable tension in the way she held herself, a deliberate, careful manner of moving, as though every action, every glance, had been calculated in advance. And that's when I noticed it, the bruises. They were subtle but unmistakable, faint yellow marks circling her wrist where the man had gripped her too tightly. I didn't want to make assumptions, but I had seen enough to recognize that this was not a typical scene of a father and daughter sharing a moment of joy together. This was different. As the parade continued, my eyes instinctively kept returning to the girl, whose eyes never seemed to leave the guards. It was as though she was searching for something in them, something that perhaps even I, a seasoned observer, couldn't fully grasp. But there was no mistaking it, her attention was focused, locked in a silent plea for help. And as I watched, I began to wonder, was she asking for help? Or was she simply caught in a situation she didn't know how to escape from? The man beside her was clearly irritated. His expression, which had been cordial when they arrived, had turned sharp, and his actions were becoming more pronounced. He spoke to the girl in low, clipped tones, too quiet for most of the crowd to hear, but I could catch a few of the words. "Stand up straight," he muttered, his voice edged with a threat. "Remember what I told you." It was as though he was trying to force her into a mold, shaping her behavior into something that would make him comfortable, something that fit his expectations. He wasn't a father. He was an enforcer, a presence that demanded obedience. I could feel the tension in the air growing thicker as the ceremony progressed. The girl's shoulders were slumped now, her eyes flicking nervously between the guards and her stepfather. It wasn't just the stiff posture or the rigid way she stood. It was the total absence of joy in her expression, the lack of the carefree exuberance you would expect from a child in such a setting. She was a child, yes, but she was a child who had been taught to suppress her emotions, to hide her fear, to never make a scene. It was a chilling reminder that children, especially those in vulnerable situations, often learn early to mask their emotions in order to survive. And then, the moment arrived, an unexpected moment that would change everything. As the parade reached its climax, something happened that caught everyone off guard. The girl, Lily, raised her hand, her small fingers trembling slightly as she made a gesture that, to the untrained eye, might have seemed like nothing more than a casual wave. But to someone who had been trained to recognize distress, it was a signal, an unmistakable cry for help. It wasn't the kind of gesture that would attract attention in a crowd. It was subtle, almost too subtle. But I saw it. And I knew what it meant. I wasn't the only one. Sergeant Theo Marwood, the Royal Guard marching in the front, caught it too. The young girl had just signaled for help, and Sergeant Marwood, trained to observe such signs, knew exactly what to do. Without hesitation, without even a second thought, he broke formation. The sound of his boots striking the stone was loud in the sudden silence that followed, the crowd sensing that something was amiss. But none of them, I suspect, understood the gravity of what was unfolding before them. In that moment, the pageantry and formality of the changing of the guard ceremony faded into the background. It wasn't just about soldiers in ceremonial uniforms anymore, it was about a child who had reached the end of her tether. It was about a soldier who, in that instant, chose to act, not as a ceremonial guard, but as a protector of something much more important than tradition, human dignity. The crowd, initially caught off guard, parted instinctively, giving Marwood a clear path to the girl and her stepfather. The tension was palpable. No one spoke, everyone just watched, waiting to see what would happen next. The girl's eyes were wide now, but there was something new in them, a flicker of hope, as if she had finally been seen. The scene was unfolding in front of us, but for the girl. It was a moment of liberation, a moment when she had done what no child should have to do, ask for help. And in that fleeting moment, Sergeant Marwood, despite the formalities and the protocol that governed his every move, understood exactly what was at stake. What followed in the moments that followed would change the lives of those involved in ways none of us could have imagined. But for now, as I stood among the crowd, I couldn't help but marvel at the complexity of the situation, the layers of human emotion. The silent battles being fought right before our eyes. It was a reminder that beneath the surface of even the most well-known traditions, there can be stories waiting to be uncovered. And sometimes, those stories hold the power to change everything. As the crowd looked on, unsure of what would happen next, it was clear that today, the changing of the guard would be remembered for something far more important than the ceremony itself. It would be remembered for the bravery of one man, and for the courage of a young girl who, in a single moment, reached out and asked for the one thing every child deserves, to be safe. And as the scene unfolded before us, I found myself wondering how many others had seen the same thing, how many others had noticed the small signals. The hidden fears, the cries for help. How many of us, when faced with the opportunity to act, would do the same? Lily's behavior stood out like a sore thumb amidst the vibrant, joyful chaos surrounding her. While the other children bounced up and down on their parents' shoulders, their laughter echoing through the air, Lily remained eerily still. It was as if she had been frozen in time, her tiny body rigid, as though the act of standing still had been drilled into her until it became second nature. Her gaze flicked nervously from the guards to her stepfather, but there was no excitement in her eyes, only a quiet, calculated fear. It was the kind of stillness that didn't belong in the innocent world of children. To anyone who hadn't been trained to observe human behavior closely, she might have just seemed like a shy child, lost in the spectacle around her. But to Sergeant Theo Marwood, a seasoned Royal Guard, there was something more to her presence than just a quiet girl at a parade. Marwood's training, honed through years of service in both ceremonial duties and active duty in combat zones, had taught him to notice the smallest of details, the subtlest of movements that others might overlook. As he marched in perfect formation, his attention was divided between the task at hand, maintaining the impeccable precision of his role, and the crowd around him. Yet, in the corner of his peripheral vision, something caught his eye. It was Lily. Her immobility was too rigid, too unnatural for a child of her age. He had seen children before, bouncing with enthusiasm, even in the midst of the most serious of ceremonies. But Lily wasn't like the others. Her body language, though silent, screamed of something that didn't quite fit. She was holding herself back, resisting the natural impulses of childhood. In that moment, when their eyes briefly met, there was a flicker of recognition between them. It wasn't the innocent gaze of a child excited about the guards, but something darker, something far more seasoned. Marwood's combat-trained mind caught the silent distress beneath her rigid exterior. It was a feeling, one he had experienced many times in the battlefield, the kind of fear that you don't see until you know what to look for. And what he saw in Lily's eyes was unmistakable. It wasn't just fear, but a fear that had been ingrained in her, trained into her by something or someone. She had learned to control herself, to stifle the natural responses that might draw attention. The way she held herself reminded Marwood of civilians in war zones, people who had learned, out of sheer necessity, to appear as if they weren't afraid, even when terror was lurking just beneath the surface. It was a learned behavior, born out of years of experience, not just a momentary reaction to a parade. As the formation moved forward, Marwood's sharp mind catalogued every detail about Lily's behavior. Her eyes never left him as he passed, and for a moment, it seemed as if she was searching for something in him, something in the solid, unwavering form of a royal guard. Was she looking for help? Or was she simply observing, calculating her next move in the maze of her surroundings? There was no doubt in his mind, something wasn't right. His training had taught him to remain unmoved, unmalleable, even in the face of provocation. But the soldier in him, the part that had always been attuned to the subtle cues of human behavior, knew that this situation required more than just standing still. It required action. The crowd continued to cheer, the sounds of their excitement mingling with the distant drumming of the ceremony, but Marwood's focus remained on Lily. It wasn't just her stillness that bothered him, it was the way she appeared trapped, caught between two worlds, the world of the parade and the world she was trying to escape. As the ceremony proceeded, he could see the small girl, her face tense, as her stepfather tightened his grip on her wrist, pulling her close with a possessive force that spoke volumes. The man's posture was one of control, his movements deliberate and cold. He appeared outwardly calm, almost aloof, as if nothing were amiss. But to Marwood, this coldness only served to highlight the tension between them, the stark contrast between the girl's fearful stillness and the man's confident, almost indifferent demeanor. As he continued his ceremonial duties, Marwood's mind raced through the possible scenarios, the scenarios that could explain what he was seeing. Every moment spent observing Lily brought him closer to the undeniable truth: she was not here by choice. As the parade continued, and the guards executed their flawless drill, Marwood found his mind torn between his duty and his growing concern for Lily. It wasn't just about performing the perfect ceremony anymore. It was about something far deeper, something far more human. He had learned in combat that the most important duty a soldier could perform wasn't just about following orders, it was about protecting those who needed it the most, and in that moment, as the crowd's excitement reached a fever pitch, Marwood made a decision. There was no doubt in his mind, something wasn't right. His training had taught him to remain unmoved, unmalleable, even in the face of provocation. But the soldier in him, the part that had always been attuned to the subtle cues of human behavior, knew that this situation required more than just standing still. It required action. The crowd continued to cheer, the sounds of their excitement mingling with the distant drumming of the ceremony, but Marwood's focus remained on Lily. His eyes, always sharp and trained, had not missed the signs. They never did. He couldn't unsee what was before him, couldn't ignore the silent plea in the little girl's eyes. The thought lingered in his mind as he marched on, his boots striking the stone with military precision. Lily needed help, and as much as the ceremony demanded his discipline, his duty to this little girl, this fragile soul caught in a world of uncertainty, became more pressing than anything else. As Marwood's boots carried him forward, his thoughts were focused not just on the ceremony, but on the young girl he couldn't leave behind. He would act, and when the time came, he would break formation, not as a guard, but as a protector. Little did anyone know, the ceremony would take a turn no one had anticipated, and a small, quiet gesture from a terrified child would change everything. As Marwood continued his precise march, the sounds of the ceremony unfolding around him, the rhythmic beats of drums, the military band's sharp notes, the synchronized movement of the other guards, faded into the background. His focus had shifted entirely to the little girl standing just a few feet away from him. It was the way she held herself that didn't sit right with him. Lily's body was unnaturally rigid, her posture stiff, as though every movement was being controlled, calculated. It wasn't the natural excitement of a child watching a parade, it was something far more forced. A child's curiosity and joy should flow freely, but there was none of that in Lily's demeanor. She was locked in place, too still, too controlled. At first, Marwood tried to dismiss it, chalking it up to the nerves or anxiety a child might feel in such a grand setting. But as he continued his march, his sharp, trained eyes caught the subtle but unmistakable signs of distress on her face. The way her eyes darted nervously from the guards to her stepfather, the way she avoided eye contact with those around her, it all painted a picture of a child who was trying desperately to follow instructions, yet there was a clear undertone of fear. Marwood's instincts, sharpened by years of military service and honed through his experiences in combat zones, told him that something was terribly wrong. There was a sense of urgency beneath the surface of Lily's behavior. It wasn't just the stiff posture, it was her avoidance, the way she flinched when her stepfather's grip on her arm tightened. There was a quiet terror in her movements, one that only someone attuned to human behavior would recognize. And then, as Marwood continued his ceremonial duties, a small detail caught his eye that made his blood run cold. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to make his heart rate quicken. Lily's sleeve had ridden up, and for just a brief instant, Marwood saw what no child should ever have to experience, the unmistakable outline of bruises around her wrist. Fading yellow bruises, some still dark purple, others already beginning to heal. The marks were circular, too perfect in their shape, as if they were caused by an adult's hand gripping too tightly. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had seen bruises before, on soldiers, on civilians in war zones, on people who had suffered at the hands of others. But to see them on a child, to see them so clearly visible in such a public space, shook him to his core. His mind raced, processing the information quickly. These weren't just random injuries, these were signs of abuse, signs of someone deliberately exerting control and fear over a helpless child. His gaze briefly flicked to Lily's stepfather. The man was standing tall, a picture of confidence and control. His posture was perfect, his expensive watch gleaming in the sunlight, and his calm demeanor suggested that nothing in the world could ruffle him. But it was the way he held Lily that told the true story. His fingers were dug deep into her shoulder, a grip that was far too tight, far too possessive for a fatherly gesture. It wasn't just a hand on the shoulder, it was a claim, an assertion of dominance. Marwood's peripheral vision picked up on the man's body language. The subtle tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes flickered when anyone dared to look at Lily for too long, the way he repositioned himself between her and the crowd as if to shield her from any possible interaction. It was all too deliberate, too controlling. Marwood's instincts flared. He had been trained to recognize these behaviors, to spot the signs of someone who was used to dominating others. The man's calm facade was slipping, revealing the hostility simmering just beneath the surface. As the ceremony progressed, Marwood's attention remained fixed on Lily, despite the rigid discipline he had learned over the years. His role as a guard was to remain still, to be unyielding, unblinking in his dedication to the Queen and the ceremony. But in this moment, his eyes never fully left the small girl standing near the barrier. She seemed to shrink under her stepfather's harsh treatment, the flickers of fear growing more evident with each passing minute. Her eyes, once filled with childlike wonder, were now filled with anxiety, her gaze flicking constantly between her stepfather's stern face and the soldiers who passed by, their movements perfectly choreographed and impassive. Marwood's mind was working furiously now. He could no longer ignore the signs. The bruises. The way Lily held herself back. The unnatural silence that surrounded her. The way she flinched at her stepfather's touch. This wasn't just a case of a shy child, this was something far more sinister. Lily was trapped, caught between the overwhelming presence of her stepfather and the distant, silent world of the ceremony around her. She was trying to do what she had been taught, to behave, to stay still, to avoid drawing attention. But in doing so, she was only pushing herself further into a place of isolation. Marwood's eyes flicked to the elderly couple standing nearby. The woman had noticed Lily too. Her eyes softened with concern as she watched the girl, and Marwood could see the slight frown that crossed the elderly man's face as he glanced between the girl and her stepfather. The couple exchanged a quick look, the kind of look that people who had seen hardship in their lives often shared when they recognized something troubling but weren't sure how to intervene. For a moment, the elderly couple hesitated, unsure whether they should step in. But Marwood didn't hesitate. His training kicked in, and he made a mental note to keep his eye on the situation. He couldn't intervene directly, not yet, not without breaking protocol. But something inside him, something that had nothing to do with his role as a ceremonial guard, urged him to keep watching, to make sure that this child did not slip through the cracks. The crowd continued to cheer, their voices rising in excitement as the ceremony reached its peak. But Marwood's mind was focused entirely on Lily, her rigid posture, the fear he saw in her eyes, and the way her stepfather's grip on her wrist never seemed to loosen. It was a grim reminder of the darker side of life that too often goes unnoticed, even in the midst of a national celebration. And as the ceremony continued, Marwood knew that the time to act was fast approaching. The girl had signaled to him, whether she realized it or not. And now, it was up to him to make sure she didn't have to suffer in silence any longer. As the changing of the guard ceremony continued to unfold, the lively atmosphere around the palace was filled with the excitement of the crowd, the sharp rhythm of marching boots, and the proud presence of the royal guards. Yet, amidst the noise, something caught the attention of the elderly couple standing just a few paces away from Lily and her stepfather. Sam, the woman, with silver hair and kind, weathered eyes, had been watching the ceremony with quiet appreciation. She had been speaking softly to her husband about the history of the guards, pointing out the various details in the soldiers' movements. But then, her gaze shifted to the young girl standing beside Sam. The contrast between Lily and the other children was too stark to ignore. The elderly woman's attention first peaked when she noticed Lily's rigid posture, so unlike the excited, carefree children around her. Most children, caught up in the spectacle, were bouncing with enthusiasm, their wide eyes drinking in the royal spectacle. But Lily was standing stiffly, her small hands clenched at her sides, and her gaze darting nervously between the guards and the man at her side. The woman felt a twinge of concern as she observed how Lily seemed trapped in a silent, fearful world, her small frame caught between the grand ceremony and the man who seemed to have an unyielding control over her. The man, her husband, had noticed it too. He was a retired teacher, his years of experience with children making him keenly aware of the signs of distress in a young child. It wasn't just Lily's unnaturally stiff posture, it was the way she seemed to shrink under Sam's harsh presence. Her body language spoke volumes, and he instinctively understood that something wasn't right. There was a subtle but unmistakable tension in the way Lily was holding herself, the way she was avoiding eye contact with anyone who might attempt to engage her. Her silence wasn't the shyness of a child caught up in a new environment, it was the silence of someone who had learned, perhaps too young, that speaking out could bring consequences. As the couple exchanged a concerned glance, the woman felt her worry deepen. She had seen this kind of behavior before, children who had been trained to keep quiet, to endure in silence, to hide their fear beneath a mask of obedience. It was a kind of quiet suffering that went unnoticed by most, hidden beneath the veneer of normalcy. But not to her. Not anymore, Her gaze drifted back to Sam, who stood tall beside Lily, his confident posture betraying an almost unsettling sense of control. The man's demeanor seemed composed, almost too composed. He stood like someone used to being in charge, someone whose every move was deliberate and exact. But his tight grip on Lily's arm was unmistakable. There was nothing fatherly or protective in the way he held her. It was possessive, controlling, a quiet assertion of dominance that made the woman's heart ache. Sam's fingers dug into Lily's shoulder, and though his face remained calm, the woman could see the barely contained anger in his eyes whenever someone glanced too long at the girl. It was in that moment that the elderly woman caught sight of something that made her breath catch in her throat. As Lily shifted slightly, trying to regain some comfort in her posture, her sleeve rode up, just enough to reveal the faint outlines of bruises around her wrist. The bruises were distinct, yellowing in some areas, fresh and purple in others, the kind of marks that couldn't easily be hidden. They were the unmistakable signs of someone who had been gripped too tightly, someone whose body had borne the force of an adult hand, force used not in love, but in control. Her heart sank as she realized what she was seeing. The bruises, the tight grip, the way Sam manipulated Lily's every movement, it was clear now. The girl was not just a shy child. She was someone in distress, someone whose every action was governed by fear. The elderly woman's mind raced as she processed what she had just seen. She exchanged another glance with her husband, whose frown had deepened into something more serious. Both of them had been around long enough to know the signs. They had seen enough children, children who were hurting, children who needed help. The woman's instinct was to intervene, to step forward and offer some kind of help, to offer Lily a kind word, a smile. Anything to break through the shell of fear she seemed trapped in. But she knew the dangers of stepping in too abruptly. She had heard of such cases before, the children too afraid to speak up, the parents who would become defensive, even violent, when questioned. She knew the risks of making a scene in public. Still, she couldn't ignore the urgency building in her chest. Lily needed someone. The question was, how could she help her? How could she intervene without making things worse for the girl? Her husband, sensing her turmoil, gently squeezed her hand, his silent support offering a small measure of comfort. He, too, had noticed the bruises. He had seen them clearly as Lily's sleeve had pulled back. And he knew, as well as his wife, that this wasn't something to ignore. They weren't just tourists here to watch a ceremony. They were witnesses to something that demanded action. The elderly couple had lived long enough to know that sometimes, silence was not the best course of action. Sometimes, it took courage to step forward, to ask the difficult questions, to make the uncomfortable calls. But what was the right way to intervene here? What could they do? Before they could make a move, Lily's situation worsened. Her stepfather, sensing the growing tension around them, shifted uncomfortably and pulled her closer, his fingers digging deeper into her skin as he adjusted her position. He whispered something in her ear, his voice low and harsh, and Lily's body tensed further. The elderly woman's heart broke when she saw the way Lily flinched at the sound of his voice, the way her eyes filled with a sudden terror. She wanted to call out to her, to ask if she was okay, to somehow break through the wall of fear that surrounded her. But Sam's presence, his control, was suffocating. He was watching everyone, his eyes sharp and calculating, as the ceremony continued. The elderly woman's concern only deepened. She couldn't stand by and do nothing. But what could she do? She had no authority here, no way of knowing the full extent of what Lily was going through. She only knew what she had seen, the bruises, the fear, the tension in the girl's movements. And she knew that something had to be done, that Lily deserved more than this. The elderly couple exchanged one last glance, a silent agreement passing between them. They weren't sure how they would help, but they both knew they couldn't walk away from this. This wasn't just a parade, it was a moment when two strangers had seen something that no one else seemed to notice. And, for better or worse, they knew that they had to act, even if it meant standing up to a man who was used to having control. the woman's hand went to her husband's arm, and with a determined sigh, she took a small step toward Lily. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The first step in a much larger journey that would unfold in ways none of them could yet imagine. The ceremony continued around them, but the festive cheer of the crowd seemed distant to Lily. She stood still, her posture rigid, her hand still gripped tightly by her stepfather, Sam. Every now and then, her eyes would flicker toward the guards, but her gaze was always drawn back to the ground. She seemed lost in her own world, caught somewhere between the excitement of the parade and the overwhelming tension of the situation she was in. It was as if she longed to be part of the celebration, but knew she couldn't. She was trapped in a silent agony of fear. Marwood, ever vigilant as a royal guard, maintained his perfect attention, his gaze forward and unyielding. But as he passed the small group, his trained eyes did not miss the subtle shift in Lily's body language. It wasn't just the stiff posture or the nervous glances. It was something more. A small, almost imperceptible movement, a shift in the way she stood. A flicker of something that broke through the layers of fear she had so carefully constructed. For the briefest of moments, as Sam's attention wandered, Lily raised her hand, just slightly, and in such a way that no one who wasn't looking for it would have noticed. To the casual observer, it might have looked like a child trying to push hair from her eyes, or perhaps waving at the passing guards. But to someone trained to recognize the signs, it was unmistakable. The motion was subtle, too subtle for most people to see, but not for Marwood. In the span of a heartbeat, he registered the gesture for what it was, a distress signal. A small, clenched fist opening and closing, then pressing gently against her palm. The universal sign taught to children as a silent plea for help. It was something that, if recognized, could change everything. Marwood's combat experience had taught him to always be aware of his surroundings, to read the smallest cues of discomfort, distress, or danger. It had been years since he had learned the signs of distress from children in vulnerable situations, years spent protecting those who needed help without them ever uttering a word. And in that moment, when Lily made her silent plea, Marwood's military-trained mind snapped into action, his gaze flicked back toward her, his peripheral vision noting the subtle shift in her expression, the way her eyes, for just a fraction of a second, softened before her gaze quickly dropped again. The gesture was barely noticeable, but it was enough for Marwood to make the connection. There was something wrong, his thoughts raced. The bruises, the tight grip of Sam's hand, the unnatural stillness of Lily, all of it lined up now in a way that couldn't be ignored. She wasn't just a shy child overwhelmed by the ceremony. This was more than that. There was a quiet urgency in Lily's body language. A desperation she had learned to mask over time. But in that small gesture, she had reached out, hoping someone would see her, hoping someone would care enough to do something. Marwood's breath caught in his throat. There was no mistaking it now, this was not a child simply overwhelmed by the crowd. This was a child in distress, a child trapped in a situation that no one should have to endure. And she had just signaled to him. She had just told him, without a single word, that she needed help. He could see her now, standing rigid and silent beside Sam, her eyes wide with fear. She hadn't spoken, but everything about her was speaking to him. It was as though she had reached out through the only means she had left. Through the signal that children in danger often use when they have no other way to call for help. A simple gesture, and yet it was louder than any cry. Without thinking, Marwood's mind shifted gears. He had been trained for combat, trained to deal with threats in the most dangerous of situations. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a child, a vulnerable child standing just feet away from him, begging for rescue without a word being spoken. And as the ceremony carried on, the tension around them slowly mounting, Marwood knew that he could no longer just stand there, he had to act. He had to break the silence. The decision was made in an instant. There was no hesitation, no time to second-guess himself. He wasn't just a guard at that moment, he was a protector. A protector of someone who couldn't protect themselves. And Lily needed him now, as the band played on, and the guards marched forward with their precise, measured steps, Marwood's heart raced. The uniform, the ceremony, the crowds, everything around him seemed to fade into the background. All that mattered now was the small girl standing helplessly beside her stepfather. And as he broke formation, stepping away from his post with a clarity of purpose, he knew there was no turning back. Lily had sent a silent plea, and he was answering it. The ceremony continued around them, the band's music swelling, the crowd's cheers rising in collective excitement. Yet, for Sergeant Theo Marwood, none of that mattered anymore. His gaze, sharp and focused, had long since left the ceremonial precision of the parade. It was now fixed entirely on Lily, the small girl standing rigidly beside her stepfather, her expression a mixture of fear and desperation. Her brief, subtle distress signal, the small hand gesture that no one else seemed to notice, had shattered any semblance of normalcy for him. The world around him began to blur as his training took over. Marwood had been trained to keep his composure under the harshest of conditions, through brutal combat in foreign lands, through extreme pressure, and during intense ceremonies. But this was different. The mission was clear now, and it had nothing to do with parades or protocol. It had everything to do with a child in danger. Marwood's eyes shifted back to Sam, the man whose presence had become the focal point of his concern. The way he gripped Lily's wrist, the way he manipulated her every movement. All while maintaining an air of cold authority, it was a pattern that struck Marwood deeply. His peripheral vision had already noted the bruises around Lily's wrist, and now, watching the way Sam handled her, it was impossible to ignore what was happening. For a moment, Marwood paused. His mind ran through his training. His role as a royal guard was to maintain discipline, to remain unmoved, to follow protocol. He had spent years perfecting the art of standing still, of remaining perfectly at attention, no matter what happened around him. But this wasn't just about standing still anymore. This was about what was right. It was about protecting someone who couldn't protect themselves. And so, Marwood did something no one expected. He broke formation. The change was subtle at first. The sound of his boots striking the stone pathway was slightly different, sharper than the perfectly synchronized march of the other guards. The crowd, initially confused, started to murmur, their attention diverted from the ceremony to the unexpected shift in the Royal Guard's discipline, but Marwood didn't care about the murmurs, the questions, or the stares. His focus was on Lily and the man beside her. His boots moved with purpose, cutting through the crowd, his gaze locked on Sam. The line of sight was clear now, and there was no turning back. The people in the crowd took notice as Marwood closed the distance between himself and Sam, who had yet to notice the guard's approach. His hand, still tightly gripping Lily's arm, remained unyielding. Sam had been too distracted by the passing ceremony, by his own growing discomfort, to realize that his actions were being observed, but when he finally saw Marwood moving toward him, his expression shifted. It was a look of surprise, followed by confusion, and then, as the realization hit him, a flicker of defiance. Marwood's steps were measured and purposeful, each one carrying with it the weight of a decision already made. He was no longer just a guard performing a ceremonial duty, he was a man acting on a moral imperative, driven by something far greater than any protocol. He had recognized the signs. He had seen the distress. And now he was determined to ensure Lily's safety. He reached Sam, and without hesitation, Marwood's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "Release the child," he said, his tone firm, clear, and unyielding. The authority in his voice was immediate and undeniable, but there was no anger in it, only the calm, controlled force of someone who had seen the signs of danger and was unwilling to let it pass unchecked. Sam's eyes widened in shock, his grip on Lily's arm tightening in a reflexive response. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't speak, as though he couldn't fathom why someone would dare challenge him, especially in front of a crowd. But the realization quickly dawned on him that Marwood wasn't going to back down. He wasn't just another tourist or bystander. He was a soldier, one who had made a promise to protect and defend. "You don't have the right," Sam finally snapped, trying to maintain his composure. His tone was defensive, but the wavering edge in his voice betrayed his unease. "This is my daughter," he added, though his words lacked the warmth of a father's love. His grip on Lily's arm remained tight, but there was something different now in his posture. The confidence he had carried with him moments before was starting to crack. Marwood, however, didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto Sam's with a steady, unwavering gaze. "I observed the distress signal. Protocol requires me to ensure the child's safety. She is not safe with you." The crowd had begun to take notice of the exchange now. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers, their attention shifting from the ceremony to the unfolding scene. Marwood's stance was firm, military precision evident in his every movement. His eyes never left Lily, who now stood trembling slightly, her gaze flickering between her stepfather and Marwood. It was as if she was waiting for something, anything, that might give her the courage to speak, but Lily didn't speak. Instead, she looked up at Sam, her eyes filled with a kind of quiet terror. Her small body tensed, and though she stood next to Sam, it was as though she was standing on an entirely different plane from him. The space between them had never been more palpable, as if an invisible force had placed a barrier between them. Sam's grip on her arm tightened further in an attempt to assert his control, but the strength behind Marwood's words and presence was too much to ignore. Marwood's gaze flicked to the crowd, noticing the concerned faces of the elderly couple who had first caught sight of Lily's distress. The woman's hand went to her mouth as she observed the growing tension, and the man, his brow furrowed, was now shifting closer to the scene. Others had begun to pull out their phones, recording the moment unfolding before them. Sam's facade was crumbling. "This is ridiculous," he spat, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and panic. "We're just here for a tour. It's none of your business." But his words were weak now, less confident, as his body subconsciously took a step back. His grip on Lily's arm wavered, and for the briefest of moments. It loosened just enough for Lily to shift away slightly. Marwood didn't back down. "Step aside," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of military authority. "The safety of the child comes before everything else. Release her." There was no more room for hesitation. The moment was here. Marwood had broken formation, but in doing so, he had stepped into the role that mattered most, the protector. And as he stood before Sam, his eyes unwavering, his voice steady, it was clear that he was not going to let the situation slip by unnoticed. Sam reluctantly released his grip on Lily's arm, his confusion evident as he faced Marwood's unwavering authority. Marwood's eyes remained locked on him, calm yet firm. Turning to Lily, Marwood softly asked, "Are you all right?" Lily, fearful yet hopeful, nodded and whispered, "I'm okay." Marwood nodded in return, silently calculating the next steps, his focus on Lily's safety. Sam, growing defensive, insisted, "She's fine. This is a misunderstanding." Marwood stood his ground, replying, "I observed the distress signal. My duty is to protect the child." The crowd watched in silence as Sam grew more agitated, trying to brush off Marwood's intervention. "She's my daughter," he claimed, his voice rising. Marwood's response was clear and firm, "I have every right to intervene when a child is in danger." Sam, flustered, challenged, "What are you going to do, arrest me?" But Marwood remained calm, "I'm not here to arrest you. I'm here to make sure she's safe." With the crowd now fully aware of the tension, Marwood's steady presence broke Sam's resolve. The grip on Lily's arm loosened, allowing her to step away. As security approached, Marwood turned to them, ordering, "She needs immediate protection." Lily, finally free, stood quietly, her fear beginning to melt away as Officer Wilson reassured her, "You're safe now, sweetheart." The elderly couple and other witnesses confirmed the abuse they had seen. Adding weight to the growing evidence against Sam, Lily, finding her voice, whispered, "He hurts me." The officers listened carefully, offering her comfort. For the first time, Lily felt safe, her courage emerging as she spoke her truth. Marwood, knowing he had done what was needed, watched as Lily took the first steps toward freedom, her future now more hopeful than ever. She opened her mouth, her voice shaky at first, but growing steadier with each word. "I don't want to go back." "With him," she whispered, her eyes dropping to the ground as if the words were too heavy to carry. "I want to be safe." Marwood's heart clenched, but he kept his expression calm and firm, offering the same steady presence he had used to face countless challenges in the past. "You will be, Lily," he assured her. "I won't let anything happen to you. I'll take care of you, I promise." With a deep, hesitant breath, Lily finally looked up at him again, her eyes filled with something new, hope. "Okay," she said softly, her voice barely audible but clear enough to carry the weight of a decision that would forever change her life. "I'll stay with you." In that moment, a quiet resolution passed between them, a silent understanding that this was the beginning of something new. Lily was no longer a frightened child trapped in a world of fear and uncertainty. She was now someone with a future where she would not be alone. With Marwood, she would find safety and love, something she had never known before. The elderly couple, who had watched the exchange from a distance, gave each other a knowing look. They, too, recognized the significance of this moment. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, murmurs of support for Lily echoed through the air, but for Marwood and the young girl, the world had narrowed down to a single truth: this was the moment when fear began to fade. And hope started to take its place. Marwood stood up, offering his hand to Lily, who hesitated for a moment before taking it. They walked together toward the palace gates, and as they stepped into the future, there was a new sense of calm in the air, a sense of renewal. The story, though filled with darkness and pain, was a reminder of the importance of recognizing the signs of child abuse and the incredible bravery it takes for someone to step outside of their role and protect those who are vulnerable. It highlighted the courage of one soldier who chose to act when no one else did, and the strength of a young girl who found the courage to finally ask for help. Lily's journey was far from over, but as she walked beside Marwood, the first steps of her new life had already begun. A life where she could finally be herself, safe and loved, something every child deserves but so many are denied. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like and share it. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring videos. Thanks again and see you in the next one.